What I want to talk to you about today are literary biographies. Now, biographies of writers and literary biographies are some of my favorite kinds of books to read. For whatever reason, I have a fascination with the lives of writers and where their creative impulse comes from, and how their lives intersect with their writing. And literary biographies actually kind of look at that relationship between the life of the author and the works that they wrote. So this month, or excuse me, last month, was Nonfiction November, and it just so happened that I found two fairly new books that were coming out about two of my favorite authors. The first one of those books, which you've heard me talk about in November, was The Saddest Words, William Faulkner's Civil War by Michael Gora, and then the second one was Balzac's Lives by Peter Brooks. Balzac and Faulkner are easily two of my favorite all-time writers. So I was really excited about these books. One of them I liked a lot, and one of them I liked a lot less. Having said that, I don't think either book is particularly bad. It's just that The Saddest Words really kind of disappointed me. What I was hoping for with The Saddest Words was a fairly text-based discussion of race in the works of William Faulkner, and how that reflected Faulkner's own idea about race. And of course that would then tie back to the Civil War, because the Civil War in the South is the ultimate event. It's the event which changed the relationship between the races, at least temporarily, and then kind of set in motion what a lot of Southerners see as kind of this Southern tragedy in which their culture and way of life was changed. And I wanted to, kind of hear from a real expert like Gora about that subject. But the book disappointed me in a number of ways. If you saw, I put out a video about the authorial voice, and part of that was probably too much, was about whether or not you liked it if authors wrote in the first person. This is the book I was reading, which kind of irritated me with the author writing in the first person. It felt like to me that Gora was introducing himself into his book in which he really didn't have any place. If he's really writing about Faulkner's Civil War, I don't necessarily need to hear about his experience at the Luxembourg Gardens or where he stayed when he was in New Orleans, or his experience of traipsing across the Gettysburg battlefield. That just didn't. That was just something I didn't really care for. It felt like padding. It felt like, I don't know. It felt uncomfortable to me. In addition to that, Gora will constantly, in the first part of the book, bring up subjects and then say, but I'll get to that later in the book, or I'll get to that in chapter 7 or 8. And he does it so often that I don't think anybody, without keeping, a chart, could keep track of whether or not he actually got to all the things he said he was going to get to. That was something that in a discussion with Hannah from Hannah's Books that came up, and I think that's absolutely right, which did really irritate me. In addition to that, there is a lot of information about the Civil War itself. He's essentially writing, in some ways, a Civil War history. We learn a lot about the Battle of Shiloh. We learn a lot about the Civil War around Oxford, Mississippi, which actually makes sense. We also learn a lot about Sherman's war against Atlanta and Sherman's March to the Sea and the Battle of Gettysburg. And we learn a lot about the Battle of Vicksburg. We learn a lot about, the Confederate surrender. There's a lot of Civil War history here. Now, part of me, I think, didn't care for that in the book because I like for my history to be written by historians and not by literature professors. But in part, it also probably irritated me because he doesn't necessarily make a connection or a strong connection between all those things. Faulkner in Intruder in the Dust, which he talks about here, has his character Gavin Stevens said, forever Southern boy, there's that moment just before 2 o'clock and it hasn't happened yet, by which he means Pickett's charge at Gettysburg hasn't happened yet, and therefore, in the myth of the South, there's this moment at which, things could have gone differently. But then to spin that into having to discuss in detail the Battle of Gettysburg felt like padding. And if his history had something new to say, if his historical information had a different perspective or brought something new, or was always connected to Faulkner and his writings and his thoughts about the Civil War and his thought about race, it would have been okay, but it wasn't always. In addition to that, there just seemed to be things he wanted to write about in the book that don't necessarily have anything to do with the subject. He writes a really long section about the city of Natchez, Mississippi, and its role in the cotton-producing South before the Civil War. And his reason for doing that is that there was another Mississippi writer from Natchez. But he and Faulkner, I don't think, had a lot of interaction, and he makes a point that Faulkner didn't write anything like this guy. So why there's this long section on Natchez, Mississippi, really bothered me, and it just felt like he was never getting to the point that I wanted him to get to. When we do finally get to him just talking about Faulkner and Faulkner's writing about the Civil War, and therefore his writing about race in his works, I thought the book was a lot better. Obviously he is an expert in these subjects and how the Civil War and race are presented in Faulkner's major works, Absalom, etc., that how those things are presented as works, and it's very insightful, and it was very educational. And so, I feel like I did learn more about how Faulkner presented the Civil War in his works. But also then related to that was the issue of, Faulkner and his racism. I think Gora rightly points out that Faulkner was, by our standards and by standards of people in the 1950s, probably outside the South, he was a racist. He certainly probably used racist language on a fairly regular basis, and while he considered himself to be a progressive on the issue of race, he did make statements which are not progressive statements on the issue of race. And I guess I was hoping that in this area, Gora would be able to tell me something I really didn't already know, and in reality, he didn't. I think Gora said something I've said in a video about Faulkner, that the books that Faulkner wrote are probably more racially enlightened than the man actually was, that the fiction he created and his presentation of African Americans was probably better than Faulkner treated these African American people that he knew, or treated African Americans in his own life. That there is that difference. I'm not sure he's entirely fair to Faulkner in terms of taking seriously Faulkner's attempts to overcome the racism where he lived and his upbringing, but that's okay. What disappointed me more was just that I didn't feel like I learned a whole lot new in talking about that. So that was somewhat of a disappointment. I think that for me, this book could have been a much shorter book and focused a lot more on the area of Gora's expertise. I was really happy, though, with the other literary biography I read, and that's Peter Brooks's Balzac's Lives. And this book, what he really essentially attempts to show us is how different characters in Balzac's work reflect Balzac's own ideas about France during his lifetime, about the changes, about society, about human nature, about what drives people, and he does that by representing all these, Brooks does that by talking about all the characters, or some characters from some of his major novels, and how they reflect, what Balzac believed about various things. So, we meet the criminal Vautrin, or Jacques Collin, and we meet Rastignac, we meet Julien de Rubempré, we meet, Gobseck, and we meet Esther, and we meet all these characters. For me, this was just delightful. With each chapter, you get kind of a summary or a brief, summary about what goes on, the action of the book, highlighting the aspects of the character that reflect things that Brooks says Balzac believed, and that was just great. I had read the novels that all but two of the characters that he talks about, I believe he talks about, I want to say 10 characters in the book. I believe I read the books that all of them come from, it was 9 characters. All of them come from, except for the last 2, which was really nice and fun, and made me feel like, a Balzac insider a little bit, and it allowed me to go back and revisit stories and characters that I really liked, and I found that to be great. The last chapter is really just about Balzac himself, and to be honest with you, that's the chapter that worked the least well for me. And I don't think this is Brooks's fault, and I'm sure he's right about all this, but I'm not as interested in kind of the supposition about Balzac's ideas about, psychology or his philosophy. I'm not as interested in those things in his own personal life as I am in how they play out in his works. I'm not sure if that makes sense or not at all, but that last chapter for me wasn't as educational about Balzac as I wanted it to be, and it essentially focused on topics that I really wasn't as interested in. But I did really like the book. It was a fun read for me. I will tell you that with both these books, I'm not exactly sure who the audience is. Balzac used to be, really up until 70 or 80 years ago, Balzac was widely read by reading people, even in the United States, but that's no longer true. So I'm not sure how many people are interested in Balzac's lives, and this is definitely Brooks's attempt to resurrect Balzac and to tell us why he was such an important writer. But I'm not exactly sure how many readers there are like that out there. I'm sure he's doing better with the book than I think. And then with Michael Gora's book, I also asked myself the question, who is this book for? If this is your source of Civil War history, then I don't think you pick it up thinking, oh, I'm going to read about the Civil War. And I've always wanted to study the Civil War, and this book's about the Civil War, because it's clear that the Saddest Words is about Faulkner's impression, how the Civil War affected Faulkner and his work. So if you're just a Civil War enthusiast, I don't think you're going to pick this book up. If you're not already interested in William Faulkner, I don't think you're going to pick this book up. And if you are somebody who's interested enough in William Faulkner to want to know specifically about Faulkner and the Civil War, then I'm not sure that you're going to learn a whole lot in this book. Even though, like I said, the part where Gora talks about the way the Civil War is represented in Faulkner's work, I think is excellent. So I'm a little bit confused about who the audience, particularly for Gora's book, is. By the way, if you're wondering, the saddest words are "was" and "again," and that in Faulkner's work, these two words represent the fundamental, I guess, existential problems of the South. That what they remember is what was, and what will never, and what is then continues the tragedy is they just keep repeating the same things again. That the history never goes away. It's not really even history, and that the history of the South is a history of a lost cause. Anyway, kind of rambly there at the end, but those are my thoughts about those two literary biographies. I have to tell you that it did make for a good reading month. The parts of the Gora book I liked, and particularly Balzac's Lives were both two really good books for Nonfiction November. Anyway, there you go. There are my thoughts. If you have any thoughts about what I said about these authors, their works, their books, Faulkner and Racism, Faulkner and the Civil War, please leave a comment in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.